Yasser Arafat is the most iconic Palestinian in history, but also the most controversial. Some people saw him as a leader and a revolutionary.
I am declaring here by the name of these freedom fighters, we will continue in our fight till returning to our homeland, till return to our Palestine.
But others as a terrorist.
The sources of terrorist activity.
And even some as a traitor. From assassination attempts to addressing the United Nations. From terrorist to Nobel Peace Prize winner. From Fidel Castro to Bill Clinton. This man from Gaza led an extraordinary life that embodies the history of Palestine, because he authored much of it. You can't understand the Palestinian fight for freedom unfolding all around us without understanding the man who built it for half a century.
But I say there is no such thing as a distinct Palestinian people.
So who was he? How did his strengths and his flaws as a person contribute to the greatest achievements and failures of the Palestinian movement? And why is his legacy so controversial? For those answers, we need to go back in history. But first, I need to be upfront with you. This is a personal story for me. A few days after I turned 5 years old in 1994, Yasser Arafat and the PLO arrived in my hometown of Jericho for their triumphant return from exile. He was met with thousands of jubilant Palestinians. This was all made possible by the Oslo Agreements, the so-called peace treaty signed between the PLO and Israel in the early 1990s. See, I was born during the Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising, and some of my first memories were of the Israeli occupation soldiers who had their headquarters next to my dad's toy store. And one day, it disappeared and was replaced by Palestinian police. I was too young to comprehend everything that was happening, but I understood that that man, whose pictures were everywhere, was somehow behind it all. What I didn't know is that it came at a huge cost. Since then, like many Palestinians, I've had a very complicated relationship with Abu Ammar, and that will color the way I tell you his story. Our story begins in the roaring 20s in Cairo, a city that was a cosmopolitan capital of the Arab world. A Palestinian man from Gaza had moved there for work, and in 1929 had a son named Muhammad Abdul Rauf Arafat al-Qudwa al-Husseini. The world came to know that boy as Yasser Arafat. His mother came from the prominent Abu Saud family in Jerusalem. After she died in the 1930s, a young Yasser and his brother spent time with them in Jerusalem for a number of years before returning to Cairo. That's where he became acquainted with the head of the family, Sheikh Hassan Abu Saud, a nationalist figure during the British Mandate of Palestine and an advisor to the Palestinian leader Hajj Amin al-Husseini. This was a pivotal relationship in the political development of Yasser Arafat.
Jewish immigration has been adding steadily to the European element in the country.
Following the European Holocaust, a massive influx of illegal Jewish settlers was accelerating the Zionist colonization of Palestine with the help of the British. Palestinians needed weapons to fight back. So in 1947, Sheikh Hassan recruited a 17-year-old Yasser to help acquire guns from Egypt and Libya. That's where he started making a name for himself. In 1948, Yasser snuck into Palestine and joined the fight against Zionist militias during what became known as the Nakba, the Palestinian catastrophe.
A transfer of power in Palestine will bring bloodshed. Two states have been born. For the Holy Land, the immediate future would not bring peace.
Following the end of the British Mandate and the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948, the Arab League and the Arab Liberation Army joined the fight. But by 1949, they were defeated. What Yasser witnessed during this time created his political DNA and shaped his ideology for decades to come. He adopted the dominant belief held amongst many Palestinians that the defeat resulted from Arab betrayal. The idea took deep root that the Palestinians didn't have anybody but themselves. And as long as these corrupt regimes were in power, the Arabs were not going to liberate Palestine. This singular belief fueled Yasser Arafat and many Palestinians of his generation. The Nakba was an event of seismic trauma for Palestinians. Following 1948, the majority of Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from their homeland after witnessing horrific massacres, the defeat of Arab armies, and the support for the newly established Jewish state by global superpowers. They were alone, and not only were they homeless, but also stateless.
750,000 Palestine Arab refugees are living in makeshift tents in the Sinai Desert in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. The camps are badly overcrowded, and the shelters afford little or no protection against the elements.
Many in Arab countries that did not want them. It is important to understand the psyche to fully comprehend what unfolded in this era of Palestinian history. Arafat's greatest enemy wasn't just Israel, the West, or the Arab regimes, but it was the psychology of defeat that took root amongst Palestinians. No better symbolized than in the image of that poor refugee.
We, the Palestinians, are still living outside of our countries. 60% of our population are outside their countries, outside their homeland. Homeless, stateless, refugees, without integrity, without personality.
By the mid-1950s, the region was already changing, and the Cold War was starting to take shape, touching every aspect of geopolitics around the world. In Egypt, a new leader rose to power. Jamal Abdel Nasser was a breath of fresh air compared to the old corrupt regimes beholden to colonial powers. Nasser came out victorious in the Suez Crisis in 1956 against the Israelis, the Brits, and the French. To many Palestinians, like other Arabs, they saw him as a new revolutionary Arab leader and their savior.
If you have a right and nobody is ready to give it to you, so the only solution is force.
In public, Nasser championed the Palestinian cause, but in reality, he didn't want a direct military confrontation with Israel. But Arafat and his co-conspirators had different ideas. They believed that an armed struggle led by Palestinians was necessary, not so much to defeat Israel at this stage, but more so to lift Palestinians out from their state of psychological defeatism.
Our people have nothing to do but to continue their struggle. We have no alternative.
Arab regimes were against this. The border countries feared Israeli reprisals. Other regimes wanted to stymie Palestinian nationalism. There was almost no room for Palestinian voices to speak up and organize, especially in Nasser's Egypt. So Arafat left for Kuwait in the 1950s. Things started to come together in 1959, when Arafat, Khalil al-Wazir, and others like Saleh Khalaf, Khalid Hassan, and Mahmoud Abbas launched the Fatah movement. This was significant. Fatah sought the liberation of Palestine by Palestinians. To do so, they had to navigate the hostile jungle of Arab politics and avoid falling under the influence of any of its powerful regimes, while at the same time using their territories and support to wage their struggle. It was like trying to square a circle. The debates within Fatah's leadership on how to do so were fierce. One faction, led by Arafat, wanted to launch military action right away, while another faction, led by Khalid Hassan, was wary of moving too quickly and being crushed immediately. This internal tug-of-war revealed some of Arafat's defining qualities as an emerging leader. He was trying to corral the leadership of Fatah around himself, frustrated by the inaction and constant talk. While not a great public speaker or one with charisma, he was more persuasive with people behind closed doors rather in big spaces. One-on-one, people found him very lovable. But Arafat was also notorious for his temper and emotional outbursts that often felt like bulldozing those in front of him. The other critique that surfaced during this period from his colleagues and would follow Arafat for most of his political life was that he was tactical and not strategic. His ability to seize on an opportunity and tactically exploit it was unmatched. But his consideration for long-term strategic implications was left lacking. This foreshadowed a critical future juncture in Palestinian history, where many of these titans of the Palestinian national movement were either assassinated, imprisoned, or marginalized. And it was Arafat who had the sole discretion to make critical decisions, unchecked by anyone. In the early days of Fatah, those men pushed for a collective model of leadership, afraid that Arafat would turn into another Arab dictator.
We will continue on our fighting, definite. And we know that they will try to prevent us from continuing our revolution.
In 1964, President Nasser convened the first Arab Summit. The Arab leaders voted to set up a body to organize the Palestinians in their diaspora.
Wary of being dragged into a fight with Israel by Palestinian guerrilla groups, Nasser decided to create and sponsor his own Palestinian front, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or the PLO. And this was just one of many Arab initiatives to co-opt, influence, control, or sabotage any form of independent Palestinian national liberation movement. Triggered by this, Fatah felt the pressure to act. With a few commandos, it started cross-border attacks on Israeli targets from Lebanon, Jordan, Gaza in secret. People started to talk and ask questions, and the word spread.
Palestinian guerrillas attacked a bus, killing 2 Israelis. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan vowed to teach the Palestinians a lesson.
Arafat became the head of Fatah's military wing. Year after year, either through Arafat's tactical maneuvering or divine intervention, Fatah managed to survive propaganda campaigns, suppression, co-optation, imprisonment, and liquidation. This all crescendoed in 1967 when Israel defeated Egypt, Syria, and Jordan in the Six-Day War. The lore of Arab failure metastasized. In 1968, Fatah fighters and some of the Jordanian army were able to hold off and force an Israeli retreat for a battle in the Jordan Valley. This was hailed as a victory. Juxtaposed with the Arab failure in the previous year, they became heroes. Fatah joined the PLO and became the leading party, and by 1969, Yasser Arafat became the chairman of the PLO. In the 20 years since the Nakba, Arafat and his milieu took Palestinians from being seen and symbolized as the stateless refugee to the revolutionaries fighting for the liberation of their homeland.
I am declaring here by the name of these freedom fighters, by the name of our people, by the name of the Palestinian, that we will continue in our struggle to return to our homeland, to return to our Palestine.
And that was Yasser Arafat's biggest achievement. What came next was his second. He put the world on notice. Green military fatigues with a holster. He either wore the military cap or the kufiyyah, styled in a way that was unique to him. This was the uniform that became synonymous with Yasser Arafat and recognizable the world over.
The Western mass media always beside the Israelis. Your baby in this area.
The military attire represented his revolutionary credentials. He was not just a leader, but also a fighter. The kufiyyah was the traditional Arab headdress, and the white and black was worn by Palestinian farmers and represented the everyday man's connection to the land now occupied by Israel. But it also had another meaning. During the Great Revolt of 1936 to 1939, the kufiyyah was worn by resistance fighters who fought against the British and Zionists in Palestine. For Yasser Arafat, he saw himself as a continuation of that resistance lineage and a man of the people. He came to embody the Palestinian struggle and even symbolize it. This wasn't just to the external world, but also internally to himself as a person. He also believed he was the struggle. And that kind of thinking had severe psychological and material implications.
You see, there is a new stage now, and we have to carry on in this way of our struggle using all methods.
The world was changing once again, entering an era of global decolonization and self-determination. Anti-colonial struggles and their leaders were being embraced and celebrated. During this period, in 1969 to 1974, the PLO made unprecedented diplomatic achievements by becoming recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. This was accompanied by Abu Ammar's rise to global phenomenon, on par with the likes of Che Guevara, Nelson Mandela, Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, and Mao Zedong. Nowhere was this more apparent than in 1974, when Yasser Arafat was invited to speak at the UN General Assembly. Remember, this man was considered a terrorist by the West, and now he was to address the world from New York. And that's when he gave his infamous speech.
لقد جئتكم يا سيادة الرئيس بغصن الزيتون في يدي وببندقية الثائر في يدي فلا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي لا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي لا تسقط الغصن الأخضر من يدي.
And left no more doubt that the Palestinians spoke for themselves and that the world was listening. This was Yasser Arafat's second biggest political achievement. He was central in internationalizing the Palestinian struggle and catapulting it to the global stage.
First of all, it is very important to know we are the core of the whole problem in this area. You can't neglect the Palestinians.
But back to Abu Ammar's speech for a minute. The "don't let the olive branch fall from my hand" is much more significant than people realize, because it set up the calamity to come 2 decades later. Historically, the PLO's position has been the liberation of all of Palestine, and the armed struggle was central to achieving this vision. With that line at the UN, Arafat signaled a shift in PLO thinking from liberation to peace.
We will establish our independent state on any part of Palestine from which the Israelis will withdraw or liberate it. It is obvious and clear.
For Palestinians, this was earth-shattering, because it was the first acceptance of the partition of Palestine. But it was pushed through by Arafat and his circle, with his characteristic bulldozing leadership style. This caused rifts in Fatah and the PLO.
A just peace, of course, but any peace, Israeli peace, no. I think our Palestinian people are ready to continue fighting for 100 years to have their own right in self-determination and establishing their state.
Again, I am sorry you are putting this unfair questions. PLO is representing the Palestinian people, and there is absolute support from our people, from our masses, for their sole representative, the PLO, which is enough.
While the diplomatic victories were piling up, the Palestinian movement suffered other heavy blows and setbacks.
So King Hussein forced the Palestinian resistance movement out of his country in events that are now known as Black September. Subsequently, the PLO moved their base to Lebanon.
Egypt and Syria launch an all-out war against Israel.
Politicians are as divided as the fighters on the streets.
An historic announcement was made. Egypt and Israel have agreed on the terms for peace.
Israel versus the PLO. The invasion of Lebanon.
The PLO's present troubles can be traced back to 1982, when the Israelis drove them from Beirut. Tunisia, 1,500 miles from Israel, became their new headquarters.
This meant that for the first time in decades, Yasser Arafat and the PLO no longer had a base in a border country to carry out the armed struggle against Israel, and they were far away from the people they claimed to represent. Abu Ammar was metaphorically in the wilderness and on the brink of irrelevance.
What's your answer to a woman who's perhaps in a refugee camp and says, "Where is Mr. Arafat today? My land is being taken from me." How do you answer her?
I am also a refugee.
But there's no one like Yasser Arafat to see an opportunity and seize it. And that's exactly what he did in 1987. The images flickered on TVs in almost every living room around the world. Young men and women, armed with stones, rose up and confronted Israeli soldiers with their machine guns. In December 1987, Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem launched the First Intifada, the People's Uprising against Israel's brutal military occupation. That visual of David versus Goliath touched people's hearts everywhere and brought global attention back to the Palestinian cause. It also caught the attention of the old man in Tunis. He immediately placed himself at the center, co-opting the people's struggle.
Chairman Yasser Arafat had triumphantly read the Declaration of Independence.
قيام دولة فلسطين فوق أرضنا الفلسطينية فوق أرضنا الفلسطينية وعاصمتها.
It was a moment of great emotion and great pride. It seemed as if the faction...
In the early 1990s, two sets of peace negotiations were taking place to end the Intifada. The first was official, under American and Soviet mediation in Madrid. The others were secret, conducted at the behest of Arafat in Oslo. It was the latter that made the breakthrough and led to the infamous Oslo Accords.
Two-states solution. We know that when we had accepted 181. Peace has to be done between enemies and not between friends. Part of this vision is my personal vision.
Won't your organization engage in peace talks with the Israelis?
You don't mean exactly peace talks, you mean capitulation, surrendering.
Why not just talk?
Talk to whom?
Talk to the Israeli leaders.
That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
Well, if there were no swords and no guns in the room, you could still talk.
No, I had never seen any talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement.
Arafat, operating on his own, unchecked by any of the Palestinian leadership, authorized massive concessions to the Israelis. In return for limited self-governance in some areas of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, the PLO would recognize Israel's right to exist, renounce the armed struggle, and be in charge of ensuring Israeli security. This process culminated in 1993 with the infamous signing ceremony and handshake between him, Israeli leader Yitzhak Rabin, and Bill Clinton at the White House lawn. The Oslo Accords were met with fierce opposition and backlash from Palestinians all over the world.
Unfortunately, I would say by the late 80s, there was a transformation of the Palestinian movement. So much so that mistakes were made, and there was also a tremendous sense of subservience, what I call willing subservience, mostly represented by the Declaration of Principles in Oslo that was signed on the White House lawn in September of last year, were tremendous mistakes. They were diversions from liberation, and in fact, the leadership represented by Yasser Arafat of the PLO had put itself in the position of accepting a role that was subordinate to Israel, that the PLO would become the enforcer of the occupation since the Israelis were going to remain. And B, because I think the Palestinian leadership under Yasser Arafat also thought that by making this deal secretly with Israel, they would save themselves.
But it didn't matter, because 1 year later, Yasser Arafat won the Nobel Prize for Peace. This was when I became conscious of the world. And after living my first few years under direct Israeli military rule, we now had a Palestinian Authority. Arafat was no longer just the chairman of the PLO, he was now also the president of the PA. I remember people in the West Bank were equally excited and unsure about what to expect from Oslo. The prospect of an independent Palestinian state filled everyone with hope, but that quickly died. Why? Into the 1990s, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by the Israeli right. Israel built an unprecedented number of settlements, colonizing the land that would make up the future Palestinian state. Netanyahu came to power, and Hamas emerged using violence to disrupt the talks.
It is clear and obvious for everybody that Netanyahu is willing or is trying to avoid the accurate and the honest implementation of what had been agreed upon.
As president, Arafat showed very little interest in governing and preferred to be the symbolic figurehead. Like in Jordan and Lebanon, he empowered those around him to do so, which led to unchecked corruption. And in his older age, he was getting more and more dictatorial in his leadership. Palestinians were frustrated. The old man did not deliver on his promise, and everything looked like it was taking a turn for the worst. By 2000, a final attempt to make peace was made through Bill Clinton, Ehud Barak, and Yasser Arafat at the Camp David summit. It was alleged that Yasser Arafat walked away from a historic deal. Shortly after, the Second Intifada broke out in September 2000, and it was more violent and bloody than the first. In March 2002, the Israeli occupation put Arafat under siege in his compound in Ramallah. The world watched as this once great man, whose old age was betrayed by a constantly quivering lip, became a prisoner to the golden cage he had built himself. This time, it felt like the walls were closing in, and there was no way for the master tactician to escape.
People are worried, sir. That's why we ask.
No, thank you. And I am very grateful to those who were asking about my health.
But they have nothing to worry about.
No.
In the autumn of 2004, Arafat mysteriously fell ill, and some weeks later, he died in a hospital in Paris.
Yasser Arafat, président de l'autorité palestinienne, est décédé.
Though unconfirmed, the leading theory was that he was poisoned with polonium, assassinated by his associates who sought power and were acting on behalf of the Israelis. Upon Arafat's death, Palestine and the world mourned this icon.
يعني زبدة يعني فقد ياسر عرفات خسر الأمة العربية كلها مش بس للشعب الفلسطيني لأنه قائد فذ.
The father of the Palestinian national movement was dead, and with it, the end of an era that lasted half a century. So why did Arafat accept Oslo, but not the final deal that would sign away Palestinian rights for good? It comes back to the pattern of behavior we saw from him time and time again. He was tactical but not strategic. He signed Oslo from a place of personal survival and the desire to be relevant when he was confronted with being shunned to the sidelines of history. He sought to seize an opportunity and make the most of it, as he did countless times in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. For him, it was the best possible play to keep the PLO and the struggle alive after big existential defeats. Perhaps a part of him thought he could start with the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem and use that to liberate the rest. Maybe. But for many Palestinians, he is also considered a sellout. The price of accepting partition was too high to pay. Oslo was a historic disaster, and one we are still reeling from to this day. Yasser Arafat's legacy is complex. He was many things to all of us. A father figure, a hero, a revolutionary, but also a man with flaws who ended up committing a sin that cost the Palestinian cause dearly. But is it fair to only judge him for Oslo? I don't think so. What Yasser Arafat and his generation were able to do in the decades after the Nakba was extraordinary. Much of the international recognition and solidarity we see today is built on their shoulders. And more importantly, when the Palestinian psyche was plagued with defeatism, they challenged regional and global superpowers to re-establish Palestinian agency and the self-belief to fight, from refugees to revolutionaries. But we must undo what Arafat has done. The partition of Palestine and the two-state solution was always imposed on Palestinians by the West. It is time to recenter the Palestinian vision and redeem Arafat's sin. Liberation means all of it, not part of it. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.